The bell rang before the sun came up. It rang while the sky was still the color of iron. It rang while the frost on the cloister's stone floor had not yet begun to soften. It rang while the monks were still sleeping, or had been sleeping, or had been lying in the half-state between sleep and wakefulness that the night office produced. That particular suspension of the body when it knows rest is ending, but the mind has not yet committed to waking. The bell rang, and Brother Thomas got up. He did not hesitate. He did not lie there and think about it. Hesitation was not a virtue the rule encouraged, and Brother Thomas had been in this monastery for 11 years, and he no longer needed to think about whether to get up when the bell rang. He got up. He put on his habit in the dark. He put on his sandals in the dark. He walked out of his cell and into the cloister, where the cold hit him the way cold always hit him in November, not with surprise, because he was never surprised by the November cold anymore, but with the immediate demand of the present moment, the cold as a fact requiring attention. He walked to church. He was not alone. Around him in the darkness, the other monks were doing the same thing, emerging from their cells, pulling their habits around them against the cold, walking toward the sound of the bell, their breath making small white clouds in the night air. They were 32 monks in this monastery, and all 32 of them were walking to church in the dark, and they had been doing this for years, and they would continue doing it for however many years God and their bodies permitted, and the specific quality of that repetition. The fact that this was not the first time and would not be the last time, the fact that the repetition was the point, was, if you asked Brother Thomas, which no one did because the rule required silence at this hour, was the thing about monastic life that he found most clarifying. Every day the same, every day also different. The same bell, the same dark, the same cold cloister, a different morning, a different quality of the light not yet present, a different weight in the body depending on how deeply you had slept and what the dreams had been. The same and different simultaneously. This was what the day was every day. He sat in his stall in the choir, and he opened the psalter, and the cantor began, and the office of vigils, the night prayer, the prayer of the dark hours began, as it had begun every night for centuries in this church, and in churches like it across the length and breadth of Christendom. The voices rose. The cold stone held the sound and gave it back altered the way stone does. It was, in its way, beautiful. It was also very cold. Both of these were true, and both were in their way the point. Welcome. If you are in bed or close to it, you are exactly where you should be. I'm glad you're here. Tonight we're going somewhere you have probably imagined, the medieval monastery, and we are going to find out what it was actually like to live inside one. Not the monastery of the imagination, which tends toward either the austere and dramatic or the warmly romantic, depending on which version of the story you've been given. The actual monastery. The one with the cold stone and the 6 prayer offices a day, and the very particular community dynamics of 32 men who have chosen to live in close proximity under a shared rule for the rest of their lives. The one with the Scriptorium and the brewery and the infirmary and the abbot's difficult administrative role, and the novice who is not sure he has made the right choice, and the old monk who has been here so long he does not remember making a choice at all. We will spend a day and a night in this monastery, moving through its spaces and its hours and its people, and by the time we are done you will know more than you did about one of the most significant institutions of the medieval world, and, very possibly, you will be asleep. That is not a failure. That is the whole point. So settle in. Pull the covers up if you need to. We begin before dawn. The monastery we are visiting exists somewhere in England in the year 1240, which is the reign of Henry III, which is a reign that historians have not found particularly riveting, which makes it a good period for our purposes. It is Benedictine. This matters because the rule of Saint Benedict, written by Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, a text of around 9,000 words in Latin, is the document that organizes everything about daily life in this monastery, from the timing of the prayer offices to the sleeping arrangements to the question of what the abbot should do when he needs to make a difficult decision. The rule is not a suggestion. The rule is the architecture of the day. It specifies 7 canonical hours, the 7 times each day when the community stops whatever it is doing and goes to church to pray. Vigils, the night office, usually around 2 in the morning. Lauds at dawn, prime the 1st hour of day, terce the 3rd hour, sext the 6th hour midday, none the 9th hour mid-afternoon, vespers in the evening, compline the last prayer before sleep. 7 offices. The day is organized around them the way a frame organizes a building. Everything else happens in the spaces between them. The work, the eating, the reading, the conversation that is permitted, the rest, all of it fits into the intervals, and the intervals are bounded by the bells, and the bells are rung by the sacristan, who is one of the monastery's many officers and who bears the specific responsibility of ensuring that the entire community's day runs on the correct schedule. The sacristan has, in this period, no mechanical clock. The mechanical clock will not arrive in Europe for another 50 years. He tells the time by a water clock, a candle clock, or by the position of the stars in the night sky, and he is very good at this. He has been doing it for a long time, and on most mornings the bell rings when it should ring. On the mornings when it does not ring on time, the abbot notices and the abbot says something, and the sacristan makes note. Brother Thomas had been a novice in this monastery when he was 16 years old. His father had been a minor landowner in the county, a man with 5 sons and not enough land to divide among 5, and the practical arithmetic of inheritance had sent Thomas to the monastery, the way it sent many younger sons to the monastery. Not because of a burning vocation exactly, though Thomas had had something, even at 16, that he could describe as a pull toward the life, but because the options were the monastery or the army or a form of dependent poverty that the monastery, at least, avoided. He had arrived on a September morning with a small bundle of clothing and a psalter that had been his mother's, and he had been met by the novice master, a man named Brother William who had been novice master for 20 years and who looked at new arrivals the way a farmer looks at untested land, with the specific assessment of someone calculating what work lies ahead. The novice master had given Thomas a cell. He had given him the rule to read. He had given him instruction in the liturgy, which Thomas did not know, and in the customs of the house, which Thomas did not know, and in the hierarchy of the monastery's officers, which Thomas did not know. He had given him, above all, time. Time was what the novitiate was, a period of time, a year minimum, in which you learned whether you were suited to the life, and the life was suited to you. Some novices left. They left in the first weeks, when the cold and the early hours and the silence and the unfamiliarity of the liturgy combined into an experience they could not accommodate. They left after months, when the initial adjustment had been made but something deeper had not settled. They left rarely after taking their vows, the vows of stability, conversion of life and obedience, which were permanent and which, once taken, you were expected to keep. Thomas had not left. At the end of his novitiate year, he had stood before the community and he had read his profession, his vow, aloud, and he had placed it on the altar, and he had prostrated himself before the brothers, and he had become a monk. He had been here ever since. He was now 27. He would be here for the rest of his life. He had made peace with this, more than peace. There were mornings, this morning, the cold dark of November with the psalms beginning in the choir, when he felt that the life was not a constriction but a channel, a directed thing, a deliberate thing, a shape that gave other things their shape. He was not always sure of this. On the difficult days he was not sure of it at all. But on mornings like this one, the cold and the psalms and the breath of the community visible in the church air, he was sure enough. The architecture of the monastery was the architecture of its purpose, which meant it was organized around the church at its center. The church was the largest building. Everything else arranged itself in relation to the church. the way the planets arrange themselves in relation to the sun, not by accident, but by the gravitational logic of what matters most. To the south of the church was the Cloister Garth, the square courtyard around which the covered walkways ran, the walkways connecting all the main buildings of the monastery to each other, and providing the monks with a place to walk in all weathers without going into the open. The cloister was the monastery's main circulation space, the place where monks moved between church and chapter house and refectory and dormitory without getting wet. In the English climate, this was not a luxury. It was a practical necessity. To the east of the cloister was the chapter house, where the community gathered every morning after prime to hear the reading of a chapter of the rule, to confess to public faults, to discuss the business of the monastery, and to receive the abbot's guidance and correction. The chapter house was the monastery's parliament, its courthouse, and its daily briefing room, all in one. To the south of the cloister was the refectory, the dining hall, where the monks ate their 2 meals on ordinary days and their 1 meal on fast days. Also to the south, connected to the refectory complex, was the kitchen which produced the food and the cellarer's range, which stored the food and the other supplies. To the west was the lay brothers' range, in those monasteries that had lay brothers, the conversi, the men who had taken a modified form of monastic vows, but who did the heavy manual labor that allowed the choir monks to spend more of their time in prayer. The dormitory was above the chapter house on the east side, which placed it conveniently close to the church through the night stair, the direct staircase from the dormitory to the transept, by which the monks descended for the night office without having to go through the cloister in the cold. The night stair was one of the small practical mercies of monastic architecture. Someone had thought about the monks' feet on cold stone at 2 in the morning. Someone had built them a shorter path. This thoughtfulness was also part of the rule's tradition, not asceticism for its own sake, but a reasonable care for the human body that serves the spiritual purpose. You could not pray well if your feet were frostbitten. The night stair was sound theology as much as practical architecture. Outside the main cloister complex, arranged in the surrounding precinct, were the other buildings the monastery required: the infirmary, where the sick and elderly monks lived; the guest house, where visitors were received according to the rule's instruction to welcome all guests as Christ; the abbot's lodging, which had grown over the years from a simple room to a small house reflecting the abbot's dual role as spiritual leader and important local lord; the barns and stables and workshops of the monastery's agricultural operations, the mill beside the stream, the fish ponds that provided the community's Friday protein, the orchard and the kitchen garden. The monastery was not a building. It was a small town organized around a single purpose. A small town whose residents had agreed to live according to a single rule. A small town that had been operating, in various forms, for over 300 years. Brother Edmund was the precentor, which meant that he was responsible for the liturgy. He chose the chants. He trained the choir. He organized the singers by voice and by competence. He corrected the singing when it went wrong, which it did regularly, because singing 6 or 7 offices a day for years at a time produced a certain quality of inattention that even the most dedicated choir monks were subject to. The wandering of the mind that comes when you have sung a particular psalm so many times that the words have become familiar to the point of invisibility. Edmund was 41 years old and he had been precentor for 6 years, and he had opinions about singing that he expressed, carefully, within the constraints of the rule's requirements for humility, but that were opinions nonetheless. He believed that the singing in this house had declined since the time of the previous precentor, who had been, Edmund was willing to admit, a more gifted musician than himself, but who had trained the choir to a standard that Edmund was finding it difficult to maintain. He believed that Brother Robert, who was a tenor and who had been in the choir for 20 years, had developed a habit of dragging the tempo that was affecting the whole choir's rhythm. He believed that the acoustics of the church, which had been modified by the addition of the new north aisle 3 years ago, had changed in a way that required the choir to adjust its dynamics, and that the choir had not yet fully adjusted. These were Edmund's professional concerns. He held them with the specific combination of devotion and practical frustration that characterized anyone who cares very much about the quality of the work they do. After vigils and lauds, when the community filed out of the church in the first gray light of dawn and dispersed toward the warming room or the dormitory or the lavatorium where the daily washing happened, Edmund stayed for a moment in the empty church. He stood in the choir and he listened. The stone was still holding the sound of the singing. Not literally, the sound was gone, but there was something in the cold air of the church that morning, after 32 men had been singing in it for an hour, that was different from the cold air of an empty church. Edmund knew this was probably not rational. He did not let this stop him from noticing it. The silence after the office was its own kind of sound. He stood in it for a moment. Then he went to the warming room with the others. The warming room, the calefactory, was one of the 2 places in the monastery where a fire was kept burning during the winter months. The other was the kitchen. The church was not heated. The dormitory was not heated. The chapter house was not heated. The cloister walkways were not heated. The cells were not heated. The warming room was heated, and the monks were permitted to go there at specified times to warm themselves. And the warming room in November in England was therefore not merely a room but an institution, a place of specific physical relief, whose importance cannot be overstated to anyone who has spent an hour in a medieval church at 2 in the morning in November. The fire in the warming room was large. It was kept by the lay brothers, who maintained it through the night so that, when the monks emerged from vigils, there was something to come to. The monks stood around the fire and they did not speak, because the rule required silence at this hour, and they held their hands toward the flames, and they felt the heat come into their bodies in the specific way that the cold has made the heat feel significant. Warmth, after cold, is not just comfortable. It is beautiful. This is something the medieval monks knew and that we, who have central heating, have somewhat forgotten. You have to be cold enough for warmth to register as something more than the absence of cold. The monks were cold enough. The fire was warm enough. They stood and they warmed themselves and they did not speak and the fire did its work. Brother Thomas stood near the fire with his hands extended and he thought, as he often thought at this hour, about nothing in particular, not prayer, not work, not the day ahead, just the fire, just the warmth coming into his hands. This was, the novice master had told him years ago, also a form of prayer. Thomas was not entirely sure about this, but he was willing to accept it on the authority of a man who had spent his life thinking about these things. The fire burned. The monks warmed themselves. Outside, the dawn was beginning, not fully, but the edge of it, the suggestion of light at the horizon that meant the night was ending. They would go back to church soon. The liturgy continued, but for now, for these minutes, the fire. After lauds and prime, the day's work began. The day's work in the monastery varied by role and by season. In winter, when the agricultural work was reduced, the emphasis was on the interior life of the monastery, the liturgy, the lectio divina, the sacred reading that was each monk's primary intellectual occupation, and the skilled work that the monastery's various officers supervised. In summer, when the crops needed tending and the hay needed cutting and the orchards needed managing, the work expanded outside, and the monks who were assigned to agricultural labor spent long hours in the fields alongside the lay brothers and the hired laborers from the village. But this was November, and the fields were resting, and the work of the morning was the work of the Scriptorium. The Scriptorium was the monastery's writing room. It was located along the east cloister walkway, where the morning light fell best, and it contained the desks, the carrels, built into the wall, each monk's individual workspace, where the work of copying and illuminating manuscripts was done. The copying of manuscripts was not, in the year 1240, a routine task. The printing press was not yet invented. Every book in existence was a physical object made by a human hand, and the monastery's scriptorium was one of the places where those objects were made. The book being copied this morning was a commentary on the Psalms, commissioned by a cathedral in the north whose library had requested a copy. The copying was done by Brother Anselm. Brother Anselm was 34 years old, and he was the best scribe in this monastery, which was not the same as saying he was the best scribe in England, but which was saying something. He had been doing this work for 12 years. His hand was steady. His Latin was excellent. His letter forms were consistent and clear, the product of years of practice aimed at the specific goal of legibility. Because a book that is beautiful but difficult to read has failed at its primary task, and Anselm took this seriously. He sat at his carrel in the morning light with the exemplar, the original manuscript being copied, propped to his left and his own vellum sheet stretched on the writing surface, and he began. The work required complete attention. Not the emotional attention of the Psalms, which required engagement of the heart. The technical attention of the craftsman, the attention to the specific letter form, to the spacing of the words, to the quality of the ink, to the position of his hand relative to the vellum, so that his sleeve did not smear the wet text. He copied in silence. The other monks in the Scriptorium worked in silence. The rule permitted necessary technical communication. You could gesture for a new quill. You could indicate a question about the text, but not conversation. The silence of the Scriptorium was one of its sounds. The scratching of quills on vellum, the sound of pages being turned, the occasional soft movement of a monk rising to stretch, the distant bell of one of the offices, the wind in the cloister outside. Anselm worked. His hand moved. The text transferred from the old book to the new one, letter by letter, word by word, line by line. A book being born, a morning in the monastery. The vellum that Anselm was writing on had its own story, as everything in the medieval monastery had its own story, a long story that connected simple things to large processes. Vellum was made from animal skin. Calf skin, most commonly, though sheep and goat skin were also used. The preparation of vellum was a craft in its own right, practiced by specialist craftsmen, the parchmenters, who were not monks but who supplied the monasteries with one of their most important materials. The skin was cleaned, soaked in lime, stretched on a frame, scraped with a lunellum to remove the remaining fat and hair, and dried under tension. The stretching and drying was the critical step. The tension, while the skin dried, produced a surface that was hard and white and smooth. A surface that would take ink, that could be scraped clean and reused if necessary, that was durable in a way that paper was not. Paper existed in 1240, but it was new to England, imported from the Arab world via Sicily, and it had not yet displaced vellum for the most important documents and books. The quires of vellum that Anselm was working from had come from the parchment maker in the town, delivered by wagon, stored in the cellarer's range, distributed to the Scriptorium as needed by the librarian, who was also the armarius, the keeper of the book cupboard. The librarian was Brother John, who was 63 years old and who had been in this monastery for 40 years, and who had the specific relationship to the monastery's books that long custodianship produces. He knew each volume, knew its history, knew its condition, knew which ones were in danger of deteriorating, and which ones would outlast him comfortably. He felt about the books the way a shepherd feels about sheep, with a professional care that was not quite personal love but was more than abstract duty. He worried about them. He kept the book cupboard locked. He was particular about lending. He was, on the question of books, a difficult man. On most other questions he was quite reasonable. Let me tell you about the food. The food in the medieval monastery was better than its reputation suggests, and more complicated than a simple description allows. The rule of Saint Benedict did not prescribe starvation. It prescribed moderation, which is different. The rule allowed for 2 cooked dishes at the main meal, plus bread and fruit, and it specified that the quantity should be sufficient for the monk's needs, which recognized that different monks have different needs, that some work harder than others, that age and health affect appetite. The rule also prescribed a substantial fast on Wednesdays and Fridays, and on the prescribed days of the liturgical calendar, which in practice meant that perhaps a third of the days in the year were fasting days, on which the community had one meal instead of two. The kitchen was managed by the cook, who in this monastery was a lay brother named Albert. Albert had been cooking for the monastery for 20 years, and he had the specific competence of someone who does one thing for a long time with intelligence. He knew what 32 monks in November needed. He knew what the kitchen garden and the fish ponds and the barn provided. He knew how to turn these inputs into something nourishing. And he did this day after day, with a consistency that the monks took for granted in the way people take for granted things that simply work. The diet was largely vegetarian by default, because the rule restricted the consumption of meat from four-footed animals to the sick and infirm, which meant that the healthy monks in the main refectory ate fish, eggs, dairy, bread, vegetables, and the legumes that were the protein of the monastic diet: peas, beans, lentils, prepared in various ways across the year. In practice, the strict interpretation of the rule regarding meat had been loosened considerably in many English monasteries by the 13th century, with meat being served to healthy monks in a separate room called the misericord, which allowed the rule technically to be upheld in the main refectory, while meat was consumed nearby. This was the kind of practical accommodation that institutions make with rules that have become difficult to enforce in their original form. The monks knew this. The abbot knew this. It was not discussed. On the table in the refectory, the November dinner was a potage of dried peas with onion and leek, a dish of salt fish, herring, dried and reconstituted, the staple protein of the English medieval kitchen, bread from the monastery's own mill, fresh and good, and beer, because the water of the period was not always trustworthy, and the monastery brewed its own ale as a matter of daily necessity. The beer was not strong by modern standards. It was the mild daily brew small beer, light enough to drink throughout the day without significant effect, and it was one of the things that distinguished monastic life from what it would have been without a brewery, which was a life in which the drinking water was sometimes a significant risk. The beer was the safe thing. The monks drank it. They were not drinking recreationally. They were drinking practically. This distinction mattered, and the monks were, as with the misericord arrangement, not inclined to examine it too closely. The meal in the refectory was eaten in silence. This was one of the rule's requirements that visitors found most striking, and that the monks had long since absorbed as simply the way meals were. You ate. Someone read aloud from a pulpit at the side of the room, a monk assigned to the week's reading duty, who read from Scripture or from patristic commentary or from the lives of the saints while the community ate. The reading was the sound of the meal. The scraping of spoons on pottery bowls, the tearing of bread, the setting down of cups, these were the other sounds of the meal. But no conversation. No asking for the salt by voice, you asked by gesture. A specific gesture that everyone knew, part of the elaborate sign language the monasteries had developed for exactly this purpose. The need to communicate the practical necessities of daily life without breaking the silence that the rule required. The sign language was one of the more surprising aspects of monastic life for those who encountered it for the first time. Signs for bread, for water, for fish, for salt, for all the things you might need at table, and signs for some things beyond table, signs that had developed over generations of monks living under the same rule, accumulated additions to a lexicon that served the specific social situation of people who needed to communicate but could not speak. Brother Thomas was good at the signs. He had learned them as a novice and had refined them over 11 years. He could hold a conversation of moderate complexity in the Cloister sign language, exchanging information with another monk without either of them making a sound. This felt, sometimes, like a superpower. A very quiet superpower. He used it at dinner to ask Brother Edmund, who was sitting across the table, whether the heating had been adequate in the church that morning. Edmund signed back, barely, Thomas signed, agreed. This exchange contained no heresy and no violation of the rule. It was technically practical communication. The reader continued reading. The peas were good today. Albert had put extra onion in, which was an improvement. Thomas ate his bread and his potage and his salt fish, and he drank his beer, and he listened to the reading, the life of St. Martin, good for November, the feast day coming up, and he was content, on the whole, with this meal and this day and this life. There were days when he was not content. Today was a content day. He received it as such. The chapter meeting happened every morning after prime. The community assembled in the chapter house, the monks in their stalls around the walls, the abbot in his chair at the east end, and the meeting proceeded according to a structure that had not changed significantly in decades. The martyrology was read, the list of saints whose feast days fell today and in the days to come. A chapter of the rule was read aloud. This was where the chapter house got its name, from the fact that a chapter of the rule was read in it every day. Then the abbot spoke briefly on most days about the business of the monastery, the work to be done, the visitors expected, the feast days coming, the condition of the granaries or the fields. Then the confession of faults. This was the part of chapter that had the most dramatic potential, and that was, in practice, less dramatic than it sounds. Any monk who had committed a public fault, something that his brothers had observed, something that was known and visible, could confess it before the community and receive a public correction. The correction was the abbot's prerogative. It could be verbal. It could involve a physical penance, prostrating yourself before the community, being excluded from choir for a period, being assigned extra work. The rules specified the forms and their gradations. The corrections were not usually severe. The monastery was not a cruel place, but they were public, which gave them a weight that private correction lacked. Today, in the chapter meeting, a young monk named Brother Peter confessed that he had been late to vigils on 3 occasions in the past week. This was true. Everyone knew it was true. Peter had been struggling with sleep. He was not sleeping well, and when the bell rang, he was in a deep sleep that he could not surface from quickly enough. He stood before the community and he admitted the fault, and he received the abbot's correction, which was mild, a period of prostration during the next 3 offices as a visible expression of penance and as a reminder to the body that the spiritual discipline required physical discipline. Peter accepted this. He sat down. The abbot moved on to the next business. The chapter was not a trial. It was a tool. A tool for keeping the community honest with itself, for maintaining the accountability that the rule required, for ensuring that the private compromises and small failures that accumulate in any group of people living together did not become invisible through lack of acknowledgement. The monastery saw itself clearly, not perfectly, but clearly enough to function. The abbot was a man named Father Richard, and he was 55 years old, and he had been abbot of this house for 12 years, and he was tired. Not tired in the way of a sick man or a despairing man. Tired in the way of a man who has been carrying a large responsibility for a long time, and who is realistic enough to know that the responsibility will continue until he dies, which was the term of the abbot's office, for life, unless he resigned, and he was not going to resign because his predecessor had not resigned, and his predecessor's predecessor had not resigned, and the tradition of the office was not resignation. The abbot's tiredness was the tiredness of complexity. He was not only the spiritual father of 32 monks. He was also the lord of the monastery's considerable estates, the lands that had been given to the monastery over the centuries by donors seeking the prayers of the community, and that now represented a substantial agricultural operation whose management required attention, negotiation, legal knowledge, and the specific skills of a landlord. He had 3 manors. He had obligations to the king. He was a tenant-in-chief for some of his lands, which meant military obligations and feudal dues. He had disputes with neighboring landowners about boundaries and rights. He had a running negotiation with the bishop about jurisdictional questions. He had a guest house full of visitors whose needs required management. He had a community of 32 monks whose spiritual well-being was his primary responsibility, and whose practical well-being was his secondary responsibility, and who were, being human, sometimes in conflict with each other in ways that required his mediation. He had this week specifically a problem with the cellarer. The cellarer, Brother Matthew, a capable man but one who had a tendency to make financial commitments without adequately consulting the abbot, had agreed to a contract for the supply of wool that the abbot was not sure the monastery's flock could fulfill. This was the kind of problem that occupied Richard's mornings, the practical management of an institution that was also, simultaneously, a house of prayer, and the constant negotiation between those two identities. He sat in his lodging after chapter and he read the wool contract again. He drank his cup of warm wine, which was his morning allowance and which he took no pleasure from but which kept the cold out of his joints. He read the contract. He thought about the cellarer's tendency to optimism. He thought about the sheep. He thought about the prior, who would need to manage this particular conversation because the abbot did not like confrontations of this type and the prior did them better. He made a note. He went to church for terce. The day continued. The prior was Brother Hugh, and Brother Hugh was, in the estimation of most of the community, the person who actually ran the monastery on a day-to-day basis, which was neither quite true nor quite untrue. The abbot had the authority. The prior executed it. The distinction between having authority and executing authority was, in practice, very important because most of the things that authority is for the daily decisions, the assignments, the management of conflict, the correction of problems before they became crises are executed, not simply possessed. Hugh was 50, disciplined, efficient, and not particularly warm. He was fair. Fairness in a community like this, where people were stuck with each other permanently, was more important than warmth. Warmth was pleasant. Fairness was necessary. Hugh was the man you went to when you had a practical problem, the wrong assignment, the cell that was damaged, the tool that was missing from the workshop. He was the man who remembered what everyone had been assigned and whether it had been done. He was the man who knew which monks worked well together and which monks needed to be kept on opposite sides of the cloister. He was the man who told you when you were wrong without drama, in the specific tone of someone who has thought about it and reached a conclusion. The community respected Hugh. Some of them also found him somewhat terrifying. This was probably appropriate for a prior. A prior who is entirely comfortable for everyone is a prior who is not doing his job. The infirmary was on the eastern edge of the monastery precinct, far enough from the main buildings to give its residents quiet, close enough to the church that they could hear the bells for the offices. The infirmary monk, the infirmarian, was Brother Gerard, who was 69 years old and who had been infirmarian for 15 years, and who had the specific professional relationship to sickness and dying that long practice produces. Not hardness, but a calibration, an ability to be present for difficult things without being destroyed by them. He had watched many monks die. He had prepared many bodies for burial. He had sat with many men in the particular distress that serious illness produces, and he had found, over many years, the things that were useful to say and the things that were not useful to say, and the times when nothing said was better than anything said. He was, within the limitations of medieval medicine, an effective healer. Medieval medicine was significantly different from what we would now call medicine. It was organized around the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and the idea that health was a matter of these humors being in balance, and illness a matter of their imbalance. The treatments followed from this theory: bloodletting to reduce an excess of blood, purges to clear excess bile, dietary management to adjust the balance, herbal remedies whose effects were understood empirically rather than mechanically. That is, the monasteries knew that certain plants helped with certain conditions because they had been observing this for generations, even if they could not explain why. The infirmary's herb garden was one of the most important spaces in the monastery, and Gerard tended it with the attention of someone who understood that its contents were the pharmacopoeia of a small hospital: feverfew for headaches, chamomile for the stomach, valerian for sleeplessness, hyssop for coughs, elderflower for fever, wormwood for intestinal parasites, plantain for wounds. These and many others, grown in the careful rows of the infirmary garden, harvested and dried at the right season, stored in the infirmary's preparation room in labeled bags and sealed pots. The monks who were currently in the infirmary were four. Brother Stephen, who was 72, and who was in the stage of decline that precedes the final decline, still ambulatory, still able to attend some offices, but clearly diminishing, the life withdrawing slowly from a body that had served its term. Brother Michael, who had a fever that had been running for 10 days, and that Gerard was managing with cold compresses and restricted diet and the herb preparations, and who seemed to be improving. Brother Lucas, who had broken his arm in a fall from the stairs to the dormitory 3 weeks ago, and whose arm was splinted and healing correctly. Not that Lucas was grateful for this. He was one of the monastery's more difficult personalities, and being in the infirmary had not improved his disposition. And the novice, Brother Philip, who had come down with the chest complaint that the winter air of this region produced regularly, and who was 17 years old and who was, in Gerard's observation, genuinely frightened of being sick in a way that the older monks were not. Gerard sat with Philip in the evenings and talked to him about illness and recovery. Not in a therapeutic way, the concept did not exist. In the way of a man who has seen many people recover from the same complaint and who can say, with the authority of experience, that this is survivable and that the young monk would survive it. Philip listened. He was still frightened, but he was less frightened than he had been. This was progress. The novices. There were 4 novices in this monastery, ranging in age from 17 to 22. The novice master, not the same Brother William who had received Thomas 11 years ago, who had retired to the infirmary 3 years past, but a new man, Brother Edmund's slightly younger colleague Brother Robert, was responsible for their formation. Formation was the monastic term for the process of making a novice into a monk. It was not primarily intellectual, though intellectual content was involved. The novice needed to learn the liturgy, to learn Latin if he did not know it, to learn the customs of the house. It was primarily experiential. You learned the life by living the life. You got up when the bell rang. You went to church. You kept silence. You ate what was given. You did the work assigned. You did this for a year. At the end of the year, if the community accepted you and you accepted the community, you made your vows. The 4 current novices were at different stages of this process. Brother Philip in the infirmary was in his first months. He was struggling, as first-month novices often struggled, with the adjustment of the body to the schedule, the early rising, the cold, the silence, the discipline. He was also struggling with homesickness, which was not a condition the rule addressed directly, but which the novice master addressed practically by giving Philip specific tasks that required concentration, and thus distracted from the homesickness. Brother Andrew, a 20-year-old from a merchant family in the city, who had entered 3 months ago, and who was adapting with a speed and ease that Robert found slightly suspicious. Adaptation this smooth usually meant either genuine vocation or a very good performance of genuine vocation, and Robert had not yet determined which. Brother Simon, who was 22 and who had been in the novitiate for 9 months and who was, Robert believed, going to make an excellent monk. He had the combination of discipline and humor that Robert had found over the years to be a reliable predictor of a happy monastic life. And young Martin, who was 18 and who was going to leave. Robert knew this. Martin did not know it yet. But the signs were there, the specific quality of the young man's engagement with the life, which was the engagement of someone who is trying very hard to be somewhere he is not naturally, rather than the engagement of someone who is discovering that he is somewhere he belongs. Robert did not say this to Martin. He would wait. The process would tell Martin what Robert already knew. It was better to arrive at the truth yourself than to be told it. The work of the afternoon in a monastery depended on the season, the day, the specific assignments made in chapter. On this November afternoon, the assignments were varied. Brother Thomas was in the cloister walk with a text of Gregory the Great's Moralia in Job, which he was reading as part of his Lectio Divina, the contemplative reading that was one of the monk's primary daily occupations. The Moralia was long. Gregory had a great deal to say about Job, and he said it at length, and the length was part of the point. The Lectio Divina was not speed reading, was not the extraction of information from a text, but a slow dwelling with the text, a rereading, a sitting with, and allowing of the text to work on you rather than working on the text. Thomas read a passage. He paused. He reread it. He let it sit. He looked at the cloister garth through the window opening in the cloister walk, the central courtyard, brown and dormant in November, the garden it would be again in spring, not yet visible but present in the structure of the bare stems. He thought about the passage. He read it again. This was the Lectio Divina. It was slow. It was quiet. It produced, over years, a saturation, a knowledge that was not the knowledge of having read many books, but the knowledge of having lived with a few books for a long time. Thomas had been doing Lectio Divina for 11 years. He knew the Psalms in a way that no other kind of reading produces, knew them the way you know a face you have seen every day for years, in which seeing becomes something deeper than recognition. This was what the monasteries were partly for. Not only the production of books, not only the management of estates, not only the offering of hospitality, but the slow daily cultivation of a certain quality of attention, attention to the text, attention to the present moment, attention to the specific quality of a November afternoon in a cloister, and what it might mean and what it might contain, and how you might inhabit it fully rather than passing through it. The brewery was at the north end of the precinct, near the water supply from the stream, and it was managed by a lay brother named Oswald, who had been brewing for the monastery for 18 years and who had the quiet authority of the genuine expert. Oswald did not explain his methods. He did not need to explain them. He brewed the ale, and the ale was reliably adequate, and on festival occasions he brewed something stronger, a proper ale of the kind the rule permitted on feast days, and this was one of the small pleasures of the liturgical calendar that the monks acknowledged to themselves if not to each other. The brewing process required several days and significant attention. The malted barley was soaked and germinated and dried. Oswald did his own malting, which gave him control over the quality, and then mashed with hot water, and the resulting liquid boiled with whatever flavoring was available. Hops had not yet arrived in England in 1240. The flavoring was gruet, a mixture of herbs, ground ivy, yarrow, bog myrtle, that gave the ale a bitter quality that preserved it and made it palatable. The fermentation took several days. The ale was then distributed to the cellarer's range, from which it was issued to the refectory for the daily meals and to the guest house for visitors. The guest house received slightly better ale than the refectory, on the theory that guests were to be received as Christ, and Christ presumably merited the better batch. Oswald had views about this distribution policy that he kept to himself. The guest house was the monastery's public face. The rule of Saint Benedict specified that guests were to be welcomed with all the courtesy due to Christ himself, and this was taken seriously, which meant that the monastery's guest house was maintained, its bed linen changed, its hearth kept burning, its table supplied with food that was somewhat better than the ordinary refectory fare. The guest master was Brother Cuthbert, who was 45 and who had the specific skills of hospitality, the ability to assess what a guest needed, to provide it without fuss, to make the monastery's rules and timetable compatible with the guest's comfort without compromising the monastery's order. It was a diplomatic role. The guests in the guest house this week were a mixed group. There was a knight and his squire traveling north on business, who had stopped for 2 nights and who were largely self-contained and undemanding, grateful for the fire and the food, and uninterested in the spiritual dimensions of the monastery's life. There was a widow from a nearby town who came every year at this season to pray for her deceased husband, and who knew the guest house as well as some of the monks knew their cells, who was comfortable and required little management. There was a young scholar from Oxford who was traveling to a northern cathedral and who was availing himself of the monastery's library, not the private collection of the armarius, which was restricted, but the books that the monastery made available to visiting scholars as a form of intellectual hospitality, the monastery's contribution to the culture of learning. The scholar's name was William. He was 24. He was intensely interested in everything, and he asked questions. The questions were directed primarily at Brother Cuthbert, who was the approved point of contact for guests. Cuthbert answered what he could, redirected what he couldn't, and made note of the fact that the scholar was engaging and intelligent and would probably be back. People who found what they needed in the monastery's guest house tended to return. It was one of the ways the monastery maintained its connections to the wider world, the pilgrims who became donors, the scholars who became advocates, the travelers who spread the monastery's reputation simply by carrying their experience of it to the next place they stopped. The monastery was enclosed, but it was not isolated. The wall that surrounded the precinct was a boundary, not a barrier. Things crossed it constantly. People, goods, letters, ideas. The wall said, "This is a place of different rules." It did not say, "This place has nothing to do with the world outside." The world outside was always present. The monastery was inside the world even while it maintained its own interior logic. This was the balance the abbot managed, every day, in every decision. Sext was the midday office, and it was the office that marked the day's pivot. After sext, the community had dinner. After dinner in summer, there was a period of rest, the midday sleep that the rule permitted and that the summer heat made desirable. In November, there was no midday sleep. The days were too short, and the work too varied to permit this luxury. But there was a slightly longer period between dinner and the afternoon work in which the monks could sit in the warming room or walk in the cloister. This was the closest thing the monastery had to leisure time. The monks used it differently. Brother Edmund used it to work through musical problems in his head, standing in the cloister and thinking about the chants. Brother Thomas used it to continue his Lectio Divina, the reading barely interrupted by the meal. Brother Anselm sat in the warming room and rested his hand, the scribe's specific necessity. The hand that holds the quill for 4 hours of careful writing needs to rest before it can hold it again. He stretched his fingers, pressed them flat against his thigh, watched the blood return to them. His hand was important to him in a practical sense that exceeded sentiment. His hand was his contribution. Without the hand, no manuscripts. He looked after it. He rested in the warming room with his eyes open and his hand resting, and he was, in the way of a man who does not often sit still, somewhat uncomfortable with the stillness. He would go back to the Scriptorium soon. The text was waiting. It was always waiting. The comfort of an unfinished manuscript was that it would be there when you returned. The discomfort of an unfinished manuscript was that it would be there when you returned. Both of these were true. The afternoon light in November in England is a particular thing. It comes in at a low angle, lower than in any other season, and it hits the stone walls of the monastery at a slant that the summer light never achieves, a horizontal light, an almost geological light that shows the surface of the stone in a way that reveals everything. The marks of the masons, the shadows of the joints between the stones, the moss in the north-facing angles. The lichen on the older walls, gray-green and patient, working its slow chemistry on the stone at a rate visible only if you compared across decades. Brother Thomas had been sitting in the cloister long enough that he could see the difference in the lichen between this wall and the older section of the East Range, where the original construction was a generation older and the lichen had had more time. This was the kind of observation that the contemplative life produced, the slow noticing of things that the active life overlooked. Not all monks made these observations. Some monks looked at the wall and saw the wall. Thomas looked at the wall and saw the wall in time. The wall as it had been when it was first built, white and new, the mortar still pink. The wall as it was becoming, darkening, the lichen mapping its years. The wall as it would be, he could extrapolate from the older sections in 100 years, when the monks who were currently alive would be in the graveyard at the east end of the church, and other monks, whose names he did not know, would be sitting in this cloister having this same or similar thought. The monastery was a continuous thing. He was a moment in it. This was, if you were disposed to find it comforting, comforting. He was disposed to find it comforting. He sat in the November light and he felt the continuity of the place, and he was, briefly and completely, at peace. None ringing. He got up. He went to church. The offices of the afternoon, none and Vespers, had a different quality from the morning offices. The morning offices had the quality of emergence, the voice coming out of sleep, the body not yet fully committed to the day, the singing carrying some residue of the night. The afternoon offices had the quality of consolidation, the voice settled, the body having done its work, the singing richer for the day already lived. At Vespers, the community sang the Magnificat, Mary's song, the evening's great canticle, and it was one of the pieces of the liturgy that Thomas always attended to with particular care. The Magnificat was short and it was ancient, and it had been sung in this church at this hour every day for as long as the monastery had existed, and there was a quality to it, in the singing, that the older monks had tried to describe to Thomas when he was a novice, and that he had not understood until he had been singing it for several years. The accumulated singing. The fact that the same words in the same space, at the same hour, over decades and centuries, produced something in the air of the church that was not quite present in the words themselves, or in the singing itself, but that emerged from their combination. The older monks called it the tradition. Thomas thought of it as the residue of prayer, the specific deposit that sustained attention leaves in a place. He was not certain this was theologically defensible. He did not trouble himself greatly about whether it was theologically defensible. He experienced it. He trusted his experience. At Vespers, the candles were lit, not the full candle arrangement of a feast day, but the working candles of ordinary evening, enough to read by, enough to see the faces of the monks across the choir. The candlelight changed the church. The stone that had been gray in the daylight went warm in the candlelight, the gold in the stone coming through, the shadows deepening, the space becoming something that the daylight church was not. The church at Vespers in November was one of the most beautiful spaces Thomas had ever been in. He had not been in many spaces. He had, in 11 years, left the monastery precinct on approximately 40 occasions, always for specific purposes. But he had been in this church at Vespers in November many times, and he was confident that, whatever comparison was possible, this held its own. The singing began. The beautiful space filled with the sound of 32 voices in their various ages and qualities. Brother Robert's tenor, slightly dragging the tempo. Edmund the precentor compensating for this with subtle emphasis. The lay brothers in their section, less trained but earnest. The novices, still learning, still finding their place in the sound. The old monks, whose voices had aged with their bodies, thinner than they had once been but present. All of them together. All of them for this half hour, entirely in the same place and the same activity, which was one of the things the common life produced, the recurring moments of genuine communality, the brief intervals in which the community was not 32 individuals pursuing their separate paths through the day but something more unified, a choir. A choir is not a metaphor. A choir is what 32 people sound like when they are singing together. That is its own kind of miracle. No metaphor required. After Compline, the last office, the night prayer, the psalms of the dark and the blessing and the dismissal to sleep, the grand silence began. The grand silence was the period from Compline to the end of the morning offices the next day during which no speech was permitted except in the most urgent necessity. It was not merely the ordinary silence of the monastery, which was broken by the permitted necessary communication. It was a deeper silence, a silence with a quality of finality, the silence of a day concluded. The monks filed out of the church and into the cloister, and they did not speak, and they went to the dormitory, and they changed into their night clothes. They slept in their habits, actually, or in a lighter garment, depending on the custom of the house, always dressed, always ready for the night bell, and they lay down on their pallets. The dormitory was long. The beds were arranged along both walls with a central aisle. The beds were simple, a frame with a rope lattice, a mattress of straw, a pillow, a blanket. Not comfortable by the standards you are currently lying in. Functional. The dormitory was dark. One lamp burned at the far end, enough to prevent total blindness, not enough to do anything in. The monks lay down. Some of them slept immediately. The novice master had observed over the years that the ability to fall asleep quickly was one of the most useful aptitudes a monk could have, given that they would be woken 4 or 5 hours after falling asleep. Brother Thomas slept quickly. He had learned this. It had not been natural at 16. By 27 it was automatic. He lay down. He was warm enough, the blanket, the habit, the accumulated warmth of the dormitory where 30 men were sleeping. Not comfortable, not cold. He lay in the specific peace of the end of the day, the day's offices said, the day's work done, the night ahead brief and sufficient. He was asleep before he had another thought. The night was not entirely quiet. The dormitory sounds, 30 men sleeping, breathing, occasionally moving on their straw mattresses. Brother Robert, who snored, was one of those facts of monastic life that everyone acknowledged and no one discussed. The wind outside, which in November had a specific quality, not the soft wind of summer, but the wind that means weather, that means something is coming. The bell would ring. In 4 hours the bell would ring, and they would get up and they would go to church again, and the cycle would continue. This was not, from the outside, an exciting fact. From the inside it was the whole architecture of the life. The bells, the offices, the sleep between the bells again. Not a wheel going nowhere. A spiral or something like a spiral, the same on the surface, deepening underneath. Or so the theological tradition held, and the monks who had been at this longest, the oldest men in the dormitory, the men who had been making this journey for 30 and 40 and 50 years, seemed to confirm, in the quality of their presence, in the specific quality of their age, which was not simply the tiredness of old men but something more earned, more particular. They had gone somewhere. The repetition had taken them somewhere. You could see it if you were paying attention in the way they sat in choir, the way they moved through the cloister, the way they were in their bodies. Not enlightened in some dramatic sense, not transformed beyond recognition, just further into the life, further into the practice. Deeper in the specific territory that the bells and the offices and the years had opened. Brother Stephen, dying slowly in the infirmary, had this quality. The prior Hugh had it behind his administrative efficiency. Even the abbot, tired as he was, had it. The monastery was making something in these men. It was making it slowly over decades. You could not hurry it. The bell would ring when it rang. The offices would be said when they were said. The years would pass as the years passed. And in the passing, something was being accomplished. Something without a name that fitted it exactly. Something the monks pointed to with the words they had: sanctification, conversion of life, the journey toward God, without those words fully capturing what they meant. The dormitory breathed. The wind moved against the walls. The lamp at the end of the room burned its steady measure. Somewhere in the middle of the dormitory, Brother Thomas slept his 4 hours. He would get up when the bell rang. He always got up when the bell rang. Let me bring you back to the morning one more time. Not this morning. A morning some years hence, Thomas at 35 or at 40, the same cell. The same habit put on in the dark. The same sandals. The same cloister, cold in November, warm in June, always the cloister. The same church. The same stall in the choir. The same psalms, which he knows so completely by now that they move through him rather than him through them. The ancient words having found their permanent location in his body. What is different at 35 or 40? The answers are what is different, not the questions. The young monk has questions. The middle monk has the beginning of answers, not answers that resolve the questions. Answers that change the shape of the questions, that make the questions more interesting than when you first asked them. This is the gift that repetition gives you if you stay with it. Not the answers you expected, the unexpected answers. The realizations that come not when you are looking for them, but when you are walking to Vespers for the 4,000th time, and the light is coming through the clerestory at that specific November angle, and the psalms are beginning and something opens. Not dramatically, not with light or fire. Something opens. A door you didn't know was a door. A room behind it that you didn't know was there. The monastery is full of these rooms. They are not on any architectural plan. They are found only by people who stay. Thomas was going to stay. He had always been going to stay. He had known it from the first winter, when the cold and the bells and the psalms were new and hard, and the life seemed much more difficult than he had imagined. And he had gotten up anyway every morning and gone to church anyway, and found in the going something that he did not have words for at 16, but that he was beginning to have words for at 27, and that he believed he would have better words for at 40 if he lived that long. He was going to stay and find out. The bell was going to ring. He was going to get up. That was the whole plan. That was, in the end, the whole of the rule. Get up, go to church, do the work, be present to the life. Simple, not easy, but simple. And in the simplicity, if you gave it time, something profound. The monastery had been discovering this for 6 centuries by the time Thomas arrived. It would be discovering it for centuries after he was gone. He was a short moment in a long discovering. He was grateful for the moment. He was. The thing about a medieval monastery that is hardest to communicate across 8 centuries is not the cold or the silence or the early hours or the spare diet. Those things are communicable. You can imagine being cold. You can imagine getting up at 2 in the morning. You can imagine a life organized around bells. The thing that is hardest to communicate is the totality. The monastery was a total environment. Everything in it was ordered toward a single purpose. The architecture, the schedule, the diet, the clothing, the silence, the community, all of it was shaped by the intention to create a context in which a certain kind of human life was possible. A life fully committed to a single direction. A life without the 1,000 divided loyalties and competing priorities that ordinary life in the world, outside the monastery wall, involved. Not because the world was bad. The monastery did not teach that the world was bad. It taught that the monastery was good, that this particular form of the life, this intense, ordered, communal, prayerful form, was one of the ways a human being could be fully themselves, could direct all of themselves toward a single aim. The monks did not think they were better than the people outside the wall. They thought they were different. They thought they had chosen a specific form of life with specific advantages and specific costs, as every form of life has. The specific advantage was the totality. Everything pointed the same direction. Everything was consistent. When you woke before dawn and the cold hit you and you went to church, you were not doing this in spite of everything else in your life pulling the other way. Everything in your life was pulling the same way. The architecture was pointing you toward church. The schedule was taking you toward church. The community was walking beside you toward church. The whole environment was in agreement. This agreement, this total orientation, was one of the things the monastery offered that the world outside could not easily replicate. And it was one of the things that made the experience of being there on a good morning in a good year feel like something rare, like a life fully inhabited. Like being completely in your own life rather than passing through it. Like being, for once, entirely somewhere. The modern equivalent of this, if you are lying in bed and wondering what the equivalent might be, is much harder to find. The modern world is not organized around a single purpose. It is organized around 1,000 competing purposes, 1,000 different signals, 1,000 different claims on your attention. You know this because you have experienced it today, probably. The interruptions, the notifications, the things that needed doing and the things that could wait, and the difficulty of knowing which was which. The monastery had no notifications. The monastery had the bell. The bell said, "Now is time for this." And then it said, "Now is time for that." and the whole community responded. And the response was the life. You might think that sounds like a cage. You would not be wrong. It also sounds like a relief. You would also not be wrong. The cage and the relief were the same thing. The structure that constrained was the structure that freed. Freed from what? From the thousand competing claims. From the anxiety of choice. From the diffusion of energy that results from never quite committing to one direction because there are always other directions possible. From the loneliness of individual purpose in a world where no one else shares it. The monks were lonely in various ways. Some of them were very lonely, in some seasons, in some years. But they were not lonely in the specific modern way of pursuing your own purpose in a world that does not share it. Their purpose was shared, their walls were shared, their bells were shared, their cold was shared, their choir was shared, and in the sharing something that solitude cannot produce. Something that is only made by people doing the same thing together, day after day, year after year, in the same stone building under the same November sky. Something without a name. Something worth getting up for. Something the bell was always announcing. Let me tell you about the cellarer, because the cellarer was one of the most important people in the monastery and one of the least celebrated. The choir monks prayed. The Scriptorium monks wrote. The Infirmarian healed. The cellarer fed and clothed and supplied everyone. The cellarer was the monastery's quartermaster, its finance officer, its procurement specialist, its supply chain manager. He was, by the rule's specification, to be a wise and mature member of the community, who was capable of managing the monastery's material resources without either excessive indulgence or excessive austerity, who would not be corrupted by his access to the wealth that passed through his hands, and who would do his work as a form of service to the community rather than as an exercise of power. Brother Matthew, the current cellarer, was 48 years old, and he had been cellarer for 7 years, and he was, by the standards of the role, capable. He was also, as the abbot had noted, prone to optimism about what the monastery's resources could supply. The wool contract was the most recent example. The monastery's flock of sheep, maintained on the outlying grazing land, produced a certain quantity of wool per year. This quantity was known approximately. Matthew had agreed to supply a merchant in the town with a quantity that exceeded this approximate amount by a margin that the abbot found concerning. The margin was not enormous. The flock might produce enough if the year was good and no illness reduced it. The flock might not produce enough if the year was poor or illness struck. Matthew's optimism was the professional hazard of a man who believed, on the basis of several good years, that good years were the normal condition. The abbot believed that bad years were equally the normal condition, and that responsible planning assumed them. This was the essential disagreement between them, expressed in a wool contract and felt by neither of them as a wool contract, but as something more fundamental about how you lived in relation to uncertainty. Matthew was confident that things would work out. Richard was confident that things might not work out. The truth, as it usually is, was somewhere between them. The sheep would produce what they produced. The merchant would receive what the monastery could provide. The contract would be renegotiated if necessary. This was not a crisis. It was administration. Administration was most of what the monastery was, below the level of the liturgy. This was true of all institutions, and monasteries were institutions, and the administration was unglamorous and necessary and continuous, and someone had to do it, and Matthew did it, optimism and all. The kitchen garden was the responsibility of the subcellarer, a young monk named Brother Augustine who was 25, and who had been given the garden in his 3rd year in the monastery, because the previous subcellarer had retired to the infirmary, and because Augustine had grown up on a farm and understood plants. The garden in November was not the garden of summer. It was the dormant form of itself, the beds bare, the structures showing, the sense of potential that bare earth in late autumn always carries, the knowledge that what looks like ending is actually a particular form of waiting. Augustine knew this intellectually, and he felt it physically. the way farm children feel the rhythm of the seasons in their bodies before they think about it. He walked the garden in November mornings and he saw, in the bare beds, the plan for the spring. The leeks were still in the ground, leeks being one of the few things that winter did not end, that stood in their beds through the frost and the snow, and waited with the specific patience of a biennial plant that has evolved for exactly this. The root vegetables were largely harvested and in the root cellar. The cabbages were in, the last of them, harvested before the hardest frost. The herb beds were dormant, the rosemary and the sage still showing their gray-green leaves, the hardiest of them, while the more tender herbs had died back to their roots and were waiting underground for April. Augustine had a plan for the spring that involved expanding the onion beds, which had been undersized for the last 3 years, and which had forced the kitchen to supplement with purchased onions, a dependence he considered unnecessary. He had also been thinking, for 2 years, about adding a small medicinal garden adjacent to the kitchen garden that could supply the infirmary with some of the herbs that Gerard currently purchased. He had not yet proposed this to the abbot. He was waiting for the right moment. In the monastery, timing was everything. The right moment for a proposal was the moment when the person receiving the proposal had the capacity to attend to it properly, which meant not in the morning when the administrative concerns were pressing, not immediately after vigils, not during a week when the guest house was full. Augustine was patient. The garden was teaching him to be patient. He could wait for the right moment. The right moment would come. The church itself deserves more time than we have given it. The church was not simply the place where the community prayed. It was the most significant object the monastery had made. The monastery church in 1240 in England was, in many cases, a building of considerable architectural sophistication, not by accident, but because the communities that built them had been thinking carefully about what a church should be for a very long time, and the answers they had reached were encoded in the stone. The high nave was high because height communicated something, not an arbitrary aesthetic choice. A deliberate use of vertical dimension to produce an experience, the experience of looking up, of having the gaze directed toward the vault and the clerestory light, and the sky implied beyond both. The proportions, the ratio of width to height, of aisle to nave, of arch to pier, were not arbitrary. They were the result of mathematical calculation aimed at a specific spatial experience. The experience of a space that feels larger than it is, that expands rather than compresses the human body, that makes the person standing in it feel not small but somehow larger themselves, elevated, part of something more spacious than the ordinary world. The light came from the high windows, which placed the source of light above the human visual field, which meant that you saw the light but not its origin, that the light arrived without obvious explanation. This was not accidental. The designers of medieval churches understood the psychology of light. They had not read psychology books. They had read the light. The stained glass in the east window, the window above the high altar, the window that caught the morning sun, was the monastery's most expensive object, and the most recently made. It had been installed 14 years ago, funded by a donation from the family of a local lord who had died childless, and left his estate to the monastery on the condition that prayers be said for his soul in perpetuity, and that the east window be dedicated to his memory. The window showed the Annunciation in the upper panel and the Nativity in the lower, in the specific deep blue, and read that the glassmakers of the period achieved, and that has not been reproduced with quite the same quality since, because the specific impurities in the glass that produce those colors are impurities that modern glassmaking eliminates. The medieval glass was imperfect. The imperfection made it beautiful in a way that perfect glass is not beautiful. The light that came through it in the morning was not uniform. It varied across the surface, darker here, lighter there, the blue going deep in one section and pale in another. It fell on the stone floor of the sanctuary in patches that moved as the morning progressed, the patches elongating and shifting as the sun crossed, so that the floor of the sanctuary was a different floor at 9 than it had been at 7. the pattern of light different, the blue deeper or shallower depending on the angle. Brother Thomas had watched this happen many mornings. He had watched the light cross the stone. He had been watching it long enough to know its path through the year, how high it reached in June, how low it stayed in December, how the autumn mornings produced a specific quality of red in the lowest panel that the summer mornings did not. He was a student of this window, not in an academic sense. In the sense of someone who simply paid attention to a beautiful thing for a long time, and found that paying attention to beautiful things for a long time was its own form of education. There was a monk who had been in this monastery since before Thomas arrived, since before most of the current community had arrived, who was now very old and who was known as the oldest member, and who was referred to by the community with the specific combination of respect and tenderness that very old people in communities earn by the simple act of having persisted. His name was Brother Oswin. He was 81 years old, which was genuinely old in the 13th century, when average life expectancy at birth was considerably lower than that, but when men who survived childhood and who lived carefully and moderately, as the rule encouraged, could reach ages that would not look unusual today. Oswin had been a monk for 63 years. He had entered at 18. He had lived through 4 abbots. He had seen the east wing of the monastery built. He had seen the library expand from one small cupboard to a dedicated room. He had seen the guest house renovated twice. He had been present for the dedication of the new east window, which he had described to Thomas once as the most beautiful thing he had seen in 60 years of looking at the church. He was now in the infirmary, not dying exactly but not going anywhere either. He came to some of the offices. He was brought in a chair to the major feasts, which was permitted for infirmary monks who could manage it. On ordinary days he stayed in the infirmary, and he prayed his hours in his bed, and he was visited by the monks who had time to visit, and by the novice master who brought the novices to spend time with him as a form of education. The education the novices received from Oswin was not textual. He did not lecture. He sat in his bed in the infirmary, and he answered questions slowly, in the specific unhurried manner of someone who has come to understand that most urgency is unnecessary. What the novices received from Oswin was the thing that only the old can give, the view from further along, the view that says, this is what the life looks like after 60 years, not disappointing, not diminished, just further in than you can imagine from where you are, further into the territory that the bells and the offices and the years opened. Oswin had been there. He was still there. He was the evidence that the territory was real. Brother Andrew, the merchant's son, had been to visit Oswin once, at the novice master's direction, and had come back and not spoken about it for 2 days. Not because he was supposed to keep silence, but because he was processing something and had not found the words yet. When he did find the words, what he said to the novice master was, "He isn't afraid." Robert, the novice master, said, "No." Andrew said, "Of dying, I mean." Robert said, "I know what you meant." Andrew thought about this. Then he said, "Is that what 60 years of this does?" Robert said, "Among other things." Andrew went back to his cell. He thought about 60 years. He thought about Oswin at 81 in the infirmary unafraid. He thought about himself at 20. He thought about the distance between them. He thought about whether he wanted to cross it. He was still thinking. The seasons in the monastery were not only the agricultural seasons of spring planting and summer growing and autumn harvest and winter waiting. They were also the liturgical seasons, which overlaid the agricultural ones and gave them additional meaning. Advent, the season of waiting and preparation, beginning 4 Sundays before Christmas and turning the monastery's mood toward a specific quality of anticipation. The liturgy becoming quieter, the vestments purple, the candles in the choir reduced, the sense of something about to arrive heightened by the deliberate restraint. Christmas, with its sudden explosion of light and music after Advent's quiet, the midnight mass, the candles multiplied, the Gloria in Excelsis, which the community had not sung for weeks and whose return felt each year like a genuine return, not a routine. Lent, the long preparation, the fast deepened, the liturgy stripped back, the wooden rattle replacing the bells for the last days. A sound so different from the bells that it disrupted you even after years of hearing it at the right season, the wrongness of it deliberate, marking a disruption in the ordinary. Holy Week, the most intense week of the liturgical year, the services long and complex and overlapping, the tenebrae with its gradual extinguishing of candles until the church was dark, the tomb silent, the body in the tomb 3 days. Easter, the explosion again, greater than Christmas, the exultet sung in the darkness by the light of a single large candle before the full light came, the Alleluia returned after 40 days of silence, and the return of the Alleluia, which had been suppressed all of Lent, was one of those liturgical moments that people who have experienced it describe with the specific quality of something genuinely felt, not merely performed. The year moved. The year was not the civil year, though it coincided with it. It was the liturgical year, the year that told the story, the year that moved through the whole of the story every 12 months and then began again. The same story, differently received each time because the receiver had changed. The older monks received the story differently than the younger ones. They had heard it more times. The repetition had not made it familiar in the sense of worn smooth. The repetition had made it familiar in the sense of depth. The way a piece of music that you know very well is more itself when you hear it than it was the first time you heard it. More itself because you know what is coming and can be fully present for it rather than surprised by it. The liturgical year was a piece of music the monastery had been playing for a very long time. The monks were musicians who knew the piece. Their knowledge was the point. One of the things the monastery produced that has lasted longer than the monks themselves is the writing. The manuscripts that left this monastery's scriptorium did not stay in England. They traveled. The monastery exchanged books with other monasteries, a practice of mutual support and intellectual exchange that connected the Benedictine houses of England and Europe into something resembling a library network, distributed across geography, unified by the common tradition. A manuscript produced in this scriptorium might end up in a monastery in France, or in one in Germany, or in a cathedral library in the north, where the scholar William, who was visiting the guest house this week, would have access to it in 20 years when he was himself a cathedral official. The text would travel. The text would be copied again, from the copy, in another scriptorium, by another Anselm. The copy of the copy would travel further. By this process, the works of the great scholars and the great theologians, Augustine, Jerome, Gregory, Bede, the fathers of the Church, and increasingly the works of the new university scholars, spread across the Christian world in a network of physical objects, each one made by a specific human hand in a specific place. The internet of the medieval world was the scriptorium network. The browser was the traveling scholar. The upload was the act of copying. Each scroll and codex was a packet of information that moved from node to node across the network of monasteries and cathedral schools, carrying knowledge that had been kept alive in this way for centuries, the chain of transmission going back through Alcuin and Bede and Cassiodorus to the last years of the Western Empire. The monasteries having been the institutions that maintained literacy and learning during the period when the political and economic collapse of late antiquity might otherwise have let them die. This was not the monks' primary self-understanding. They were not primarily librarians of civilization. They were primarily monks, people trying to pray, people trying to be good, people trying to live the rule as completely as they could. The preservation of learning was a side effect, a remarkable side effect, a side effect that has shaped everything we are, but a side effect. The monks would have found it strange to be remembered primarily for what they incidentally preserved rather than for what they primarily were. They were monks. They prayed. They got up when the bell rang. Everything else followed from that. The cemetery at the east end of the church was modest and well tended. The monks buried here were not marked by elaborate monuments. A simple stone cross or a stone set flat in the ground with a name, sometimes with a date, sometimes with nothing but a name. The community did not commemorate its dead with ostentation. The dead were prayed for. The dead were known. That was the commemoration. In the Martyrology, read each morning in chapter, the names of the dead monks of this house appeared on the anniversary of their deaths, and the living community heard the names and said a prayer and moved on. This was the form of immortality the monastery offered its members. Not monuments, names in the Martyrology, names read aloud once a year in the chapter house by a living monk to a living community. As long as the monastery stood and the chapter meeting was held and the Martyrology was read, the dead were remembered. This was considered sufficient. It probably was sufficient. The desire for more elaborate commemoration, the desire for the monument, the building named after you, the enduring public mark, this desire the monastery taught its members to moderate. You would be remembered. You would be remembered in the specific way the community remembered its dead, completely, personally within the walls in the chapter house on the anniversary. This was enough. You had been here. You had gotten up when the bell rang. You had done your work. You had prayed your hours. You had been a member of this community. That was the full account. That was the whole life. Brother Thomas, at 27, had not yet thought very much about the cemetery. He would. He would walk past it for the rest of his life, and he would know increasingly the names under the stones, and he would hear those names in chapter on their anniversaries, and the distance between himself and the stones would close over the decades with the specific slow inevitability that it closes for everyone. But not yet. At 27, he was in the morning. The bell had rung. He was going to church. He was grateful for the morning. He was grateful for the church. He was grateful, in a quiet and unremarkable and complete way, for the life that had been given him, which was exactly this life. The cold, the psalms, the warm room after, the bread and the potage, the text and the afternoon light and the Vespers in the candle-lit church. He was grateful. That was enough. That was everything. The monastery in winter had a specific quality of withdrawal that was not depression, but resembled depression to anyone who did not understand what was happening. The days were short. In December in England, the sun rose late and set early, and the interval between was gray and low, and the light was thin. And the monastery responded to this by contracting, more time inside, more time in the warming room, more time in the church, which was lit primarily by candles after none. The withdrawal was not unpleasant. It was seasonal. It was appropriate. Winter was the season of the interior, and the monastery was one of the great institutions of interiority. It was built for going inward. The stone walls and the small windows in the cloister turned in on itself, and the warming room at its center. This was architecture designed for interiority, and winter made the design visible by providing the external conditions that made the interior more obvious and more necessary. The monks who struggled in winter were the monks who resisted the interiority. The monks who found winter easier than summer were the monks who understood the turn inward as a gift rather than a deprivation. Thomas was among the latter. He found winter's contracted world congenial. He liked the early dark. He liked the way the office of Compline felt in December, the final prayer before the longest night, the community gathering in the candlelit choir, the antiphon for the office of night, the blessing, the sprinkling of holy water, the filing out in silence. He liked the way the dormitory felt on a December night when the wind was outside, and the 30 monks were breathing their collective warmth into the shared air of the room. He liked the cold of the November cloister in the morning and the fire in the warming room after. He liked the contrast. He had learned to like the contrast. Contrast was what gave the warmth its warmth. Without the cold, the fire was just a fire. With the cold, the fire was something you had earned, something that arrived as a reward for having been cold, something that the cold gave meaning to. This was, Thomas thought, a reasonable metaphor for most things. The difficulty gave the relief its quality. The effort gave the rest its depth. The fast gave the feast its abundance. The monastery had been teaching him this for 11 years, in the specific way that embodied experience teaches. not by explaining the metaphor, but by making you live it repeatedly until the lesson is in your body rather than your mind. He knew the warmth of the fire after the cold of the cloister in a way that no amount of reading about it could have given him. He was grateful for this. He was grateful, once more, for the specific education of the specific life. The question of why men chose the monastery, not in terms of the social and economic pressures that pushed younger sons toward it, which were real, but in terms of the internal reasons, the vocation, the pull, was a question that the monastery itself spent considerable time on, because it was a question that the novice master needed to answer for each new arrival. The question was not simply, "Do you believe in God?" Most people in 13th-century England believed in God. The question was more specific. Do you believe in this form of the life? Do you believe that the bells and the offices and the silence and the shared life and the rule are the form of life that is right for you? Because the monastery, for all its communal character, rested on an individual decision. Each monk had to choose it. Each monk had to continue to choose it, day after day, getting up when the bell rang and going to church and doing the work. The external structure did not make the choice for you. It provided the structure within which you continued to make it. The men who had made the choice and continued to make it, year after year, were people of various temperaments and various gifts and various histories. There was no single type. The precentor, Edmund, who was musical and particular, and whose inner life was organized around the aesthetics of sacred sound. The scribe, Anselm, who was precise and patient, and whose inner life was organized around the careful making of objects. The prior, Hugh, who was efficient and fair, and whose inner life was organized around the competent management of a complex institution. The infirmarian, Gerard, who was compassionate and experienced, and whose inner life was organized around the care of the sick. Brother Thomas, who was contemplative and curious, and whose inner life was organized around the slow work of lectio divina and the patient observation of stone and light. None of these men were the same. All of them were monks. All of them had found, in the same rule and the same bells and the same liturgy, something that fitted their particular shape. This was the claim that the Benedictine tradition made about itself, not that it produced one type of person, but that it was capacious enough to receive many types and hold them all. The rule was a frame. What you brought to it was yours. What the frame did was give it shape. The shape allowed things to grow that might not have grown without the frame. This was the monastery's proposition. After 11 years, Thomas believed it. He had not always believed it. He had believed it fitfully at various levels of conviction in various seasons. But on the whole, on balance, in the long view that 11 years permitted and that the monks older than him had confirmed through their presence, the long view said, yes, this is a way to live. This is a way to be human. This is not the only way. But it is one of the real ones. What would you see if you came to the monastery gate in 1240? A gate first. A substantial wooden gate in a stone archway, with the gatekeepers lodged to one side. The porter, another of the monastery's essential officers, the monk or lay brother who controlled access, who received the visitors, who turned away the people the community could not accommodate, and welcomed the people it could. The porter was the first face the monastery showed the world. He was expected by the rule to be a wise and temperate man, old enough to know his own mind but not so old that he could not manage the work. He was expected to receive everyone with courtesy, even those he was turning away. He was expected to direct to the right officer any request, any message, any arrival that came through the gate. He was, in the language we would now use, the receptionist, the security officer, and the first representative of the institution's culture. The culture was, everyone was welcome, everyone would be received. The question was only what they needed and how the monastery could help. Beyond the gate, you would see the guest house on your left and the barn complex on your right, and ahead of you the church, which would be the tallest thing visible, and the thing that told you what this place was primarily for. You would hear the bell if you arrived at the right time. You would hear, if it was an office hour, the singing. The singing would come through the walls of the church and reach you in the yard, and it would be unlike most things you heard in your daily life, because the daily life of most people in the 13th century was not full of sung Latin psalms in stone buildings with excellent acoustics. It would be unfamiliar. It would also be, for many visitors, unexpectedly affecting, not because they were musical, not because they understood the Latin, but because human voices in harmony in a resonant space produce an effect on the human nervous system that bypasses critical analysis and arrives directly at something more primary. You would feel it. You might not know what to do with the feeling. The monastery would not tell you what to do with it. The monastery would simply continue singing. Afternoon would become evening. Evening would become night. The gate would be closed. The grand silence would begin. The monastery would withdraw into itself for the night. And tomorrow morning the bell would ring again. And the whole thing would begin again, as it had, as it would. The practical difficulty of the contemplative life is that it requires you to be present in a way that the active life does not demand. In the active life, the life of work and family and commerce and all the ordinary activities of the world outside the wall, you can be anywhere. You can be in the market in your body, and in your mind be planning tomorrow's business, and tomorrow's business will be adequately served by your divided attention. The contemplative life is not like this. The contemplative life requires you to be where you are, not half there planning something else, actually there, in the choir actually singing, in the cloister actually walking and actually seeing the cloister, at the Lectio Divina desk actually reading the slow reading, the reading that receives rather than extracts. This requirement is harder than it sounds. The human mind is not naturally still. It moves. It plans and reviews and imagines and rehearses. It is almost always somewhere other than where the body is. The monastery's project, the project that the bells and the offices and the silence and the rule were all in service of, was the project of returning the mind to where the body was, again and again, not permanently, not perfectly, but returning. The Psalms helped. The Psalms were a technology, among other things, a technology for bringing the mind back, not because the mind always followed the words. Sometimes the mind wandered through the Psalms as through a field, paying no attention to the words while the lips moved. But the physical practice of singing the words, the lips, the tongue, the breath, the standing in the choir, the physical practice created a kind of tether. Even when the mind wandered, the body was singing, and the singing body was a kind of anchor. The mind, on returning from wherever it had gone, found itself attached to the body, which was in the choir, which was singing the psalms. And for a moment, not always, not reliably, but often enough, the mind caught up with the body and both were in the same place and the singing was fully itself. That moment was what the contemplative life was aimed at, that moment of convergence, of full presence. The bells rang to create the conditions for that moment. The offices provided the practice. The years provided the repetition, and in the repetition, increasingly often, the moment. This was why the monks got up when the bell rang. Not because the rule required it, though the rule required it, but because the moment was available in the choir in the cold at 2 in the morning, and they had learned that the moment was worth getting up for. Brother Thomas had learned this. He did not reach the moment every time. Most times the mind wandered and the psalms passed and the office ended and he had been in the choir but not fully present, and he walked back to the dormitory or to the warming room somewhat less than he might have been. But sometimes the mind caught up. Sometimes the singing was fully itself. Sometimes the cold stone and the candles and the voices and the ancient words all converged into a single undivided thing. And those times were the reason for all of it. The bell, the cold, the years, the reason. There is something I want to say before we sleep about the men in this monastery and about what they were doing. They were not escaping the world. This is a common misunderstanding of the contemplative life, and it is wrong in the specific way that simplifications are wrong, not entirely wrong, but missing the more complicated truth. The monastery was a place apart. But it was not a place that had nothing to do with the world. The monastery prayed for the world, not in a vague and general sense. in a specific and particular sense. The monks prayed for the people who had donated the land and the money that sustained them, and those people were named in the monastery's prayers, and the prayers were part of the relationship. The monastery was, in the medieval understanding, performing a service for the world by praying for it. It was a service the world believed in. The donors gave not only because they were pious, but because they believed that the prayers of a community of monks on their behalf had real effects, that the chain of prayer and gift and prayer again was a real transaction with real consequences. We may not share this belief. We may find it difficult to believe in the efficacy of prayer in this specific sense, but the belief was not irrational, given the cosmology that held it. And the consequence of the belief was the monasteries, institutions sustained by the conviction that they were doing something real for the world. The monks were not escaping. They were serving. They were the world's prayer, said daily, in stone buildings, by men who had given their lives to the work. The world outside the wall continued. The markets opened and the ships sailed and the wars were fought and the harvests failed and the children were born. The monastery said the offices. The monastery kept the hours. The monastery's bells marked the time. And in marking the time, in holding the day to its structure, in insisting 7 times a day that everything else stop and the prayer be said, in this insistence, the monastery was making a claim about what mattered. Not the only claim. Not a claim that excluded other claims, but a persistent claim, a stone claim, a claim that rang in bell metal every few hours across the English landscape for centuries, a claim that said, there is time for this. That said, this is what the time is for. You can agree or disagree. You can find the claim too narrow or too broad or simply not your tradition. But the claim was made daily for centuries, by men who got up before dawn and went to church and sang psalms in the cold and meant it. Whatever your relationship to the theology, there is something in the sheer persistence of the practice that speaks beyond theology. That speaks to something human. That speaks perhaps to whatever you do when you do the thing that you do daily, that you do first, that you do even when it is difficult, that you do because it is what you are. The monks sang psalms. You have your version, we all have our version. The bell rings, we get up. You are in your bed, you are warm. You are in the year you are in, not the year 1240. The monastery I have been describing is in some sense still there. The stone endures, but the community has changed, and the rule has been interpreted and reinterpreted, and the world around the wall is different in every way from the world that pressed against it in the 13th century. But the bell still rings. In monasteries around the world, the bell still rings before dawn. People still get up. They still walk to church in the dark. They still stand in the cold of the choir and open their mouths and let the psalms move through them. They have been doing this, in one form or another, without significant interruption, for 1500 years. That is one of the most remarkable facts about human institutions that I am aware of. Not remarkable in a dramatic way. Remarkable in a quiet way, a way that has something to do with getting up when the bell rings every morning in the dark for 1500 years. Brother Thomas is long gone. His bones are somewhere in the graveyard at the east end of a church that may or may not still be standing. His name is not in any record I have access to. He was not significant enough to be recorded. He was a monk in a monastery in England in the 13th century who got up when the bell rang and went to church and did his work and sang his psalms and slept his brief sleep and got up again. He was, in other words, exactly what the monastery was designed to produce. He was what 1500 years of getting up before dawn looks like when it is working. He got up. He was there. That was enough. More than enough. It is in the end almost everything, sleep well. And that for tonight is the medieval monastery. The bell, the cold, the psalms, the fire in the warming room, the food in the refectory, the silence at the meal, the manuscripts growing in the scriptorium, the herb garden in the infirmary, the novice who will leave and the novice who will stay, the old monk dying slowly in the infirmary with the quality of someone who has gone somewhere, the abbot reading the wool contract and thinking about the cellarer. The precentor listening to the empty church after the office and hearing something that may not be entirely rational. All of it, day after day, bell after bell, year after year. Thank you for spending this night in the monastery with me. If you enjoyed it, if you found it peaceful or interesting or simply a good companion for the hour before sleep, I hope you'll subscribe to Dull Tales and join us next week. Leave a comment if you're still awake, tell me where you're listening from. And if you're already asleep, which is the goal, which has always been the goal, well done. Good night.